Chapter 8 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 10. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Marianne Spiegel. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 10, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 8, Five Forks. From the hour of Mr. Lincoln's re-election, the Confederate cause was doomed. The cheering of the troops which greeted the news from the North was heard within the lines at Richmond and at Petersburg, and although the leaders maintained to the end their attitude of defiance, the impression rapidly gained ground among the people that the end was not far off. The stimulus of hope being gone, they began to feel the pinch of increasing want. Their currency had become almost worthless. In October, a dollar in gold was worth $35 in Confederate money. A month later, it brought $50. With the opening of the new year, the price rose to $60, and soon after to $70. And despite the efforts of the Confederate Treasury, which would occasionally rush into the market and beat down the price of gold 10 or 20% in a day, the currency gradually depreciated until 100 for one was offered and not taken. As a result of this vanishing value of their money, a portentous rise took place in the prices of all the necessaries of life. It is hard for a people to recognize that their money is good for nothing. To do this is to confess that their government has failed. It was natural, therefore, for the unhappy citizens of Richmond to think that monstrous prices were being extorted for food, clothing, and fuel, when in fact they were paying no more than was reasonable. The journals and diaries of the time are filled with bitter execrations against the extortioners and forestallers. But when we translate their prices into the gold standard, we wonder how the grocers and clothiers lived. To pay $1,000 for a barrel of flour was enough to strike a householder with horror, but $10 is not a famine price. A suit of clothes cost from $1,000 to $1,500, but if you divide this sum by 75, there is very little profit left for the tailor. High prices, however, even if paid in dry leaves, are hardship when dry leaves are not plentiful. And there was scarcity, even of Confederate money, in the South. In Richmond, which lived upon the war, the dearth was especially evident. The clerks in the departments received, say, $4,000 a year, hardly enough for a month's provisions. Skilled mechanics fared somewhat better. They could earn, so long as they kept out of the army, something like $6,000 a year. Statesmanship was cheap. A congressman's pay was $5,500, but most of the civil officers of the government managed to get their supplies at cost prices from the military stores. It was illegal, but they could not have lived otherwise, and they doubtless considered their lives necessary to their country. The depreciation of the Confederate currency was an unmistakable symptom of a lack of confidence in the course of affairs, since it did not arise from inflation. On the contrary, George A. Trenholm, the Secretary of the Treasury, did all he could to check this dangerous tendency, going so far as to incur the reproaches of many who imagined his action enhanced prices. All dealers instinctively felt the money was worthless, and their only object was to get it out of their hands as soon as possible, at whatever prices, in exchange for objects of real value. One Confederate diarist records with indignation that he saw a Jew buy at auction an old set of tablespoons for $575, and makes this a cause of complaint against the government, which permits men to acquire in this way the means of running away. Anybody who was able to leave the country became the object of the envy and hatred of those who remained behind. They began to treat their own financial system with contempt. When the officer in charge of the Treasury Note Bureau at Columbia, alarmed at the approach of Sherman, asked where he was to go, he could get no attention to his inquiries, one high functionary advising that he go to the devil. At every advance of General Grant's lines, a new disturbance and alarm was manifested in Richmond, the first proof of which was always a fresh rigor in the enforcement, not only of existing conscription laws, but of the arbitrary orders of the frightened authorities. After the capture of Fort Harrison on the north side of the James, squads of guards were sent into the streets with directions to arrest every able-bodied man they met. They paid no regard to passes or to certificates of exemption or detail, but hurried the unhappy citizens off to the field, or herded them, pending their assignment to companies, within the railings of the public square. Two members of the cabinet, John H. Reagan and George Davis, were thus arrested on the streets by the zealous guards in spite of their protestations, though they were, of course, soon recognized and released. The pavements were swept of every class of loiterers. The clerks in the departments with their exemptions in their pockets were carried off, whether able to do duty or not. It is said by one Confederate writer that the medical boards were ordered to exempt no one who seemed capable of bearing arms for 10 days, and he mentions an instance where a man died on the 11th day of his service of consumption. Human nature will not endure such a strain as this. A week after the sweeping of Richmond for recruits, General William M. Gardner reported that more than half of the men thus dragged to the trenches had deserted. Of those who remained, the members of influential families came one by one back to the town on various pretexts, increasing the bitterness of feeling among those too poor or too obscure to rescue their sons and brothers. Desertion grew too common to punish. Almost every man in the Confederacy was, by statute or decree, liable to military service, and yet hundreds of thousands of them were not in the army. If men were to be shot for deserting, it would have been a question whether there were soldiers enough to shoot them. Mr. Davis acted prudently in remitting the death sentences laid before him, although this occasioned great dissatisfaction in the army. Near the end of the year 1864, Longstreet reported 100 men of Pickett's division as in the guardhouse for desertion, attributing the blame for it to the numerous reprieves which had been granted, no one having been executed for 2 months. General Lee sent this report to Richmond with his approval, which gave great offense to the Confederate President. He returned the paper with an endorsement to the effect that the remission of sentences was not a proper subject for the criticism of a military commander. As disaster increased, each day brought its catastrophe. The Confederate government steadily lost ground in the confidence and respect of the Southern people. It is characteristic of every failing revolt that in the hour of ruin the participators turn upon one another with reproaches, often as causeless and unjust as those they cast upon their legitimate government. Mr. Davis and his counselors now underwent this natural retribution. They were doing their best, but they no longer got any credit for it. From every part of the Confederacy came complaints of what was done, demands for what was impossible to do. Some of the states were in a condition near to counter-revolution. Governor Brown of Georgia made no pretense of concealing his contumacy. The march of Sherman across his state seemed to have emancipated him from any feeling of obligation to the Confederacy. His letters to Richmond from that moment lost all color of allegiance. The feeling of North Carolina was little better. A slow paralysis was benumbing the limbs of the insurrection, and even at the heart its vitality was plainly declining. The Confederate Congress, which had hitherto been the mere register of the President's will, now turned upon him and gave him wormwood to drink. On the 19th of January, they passed a resolution making Lee General-in-Chief of the Army. This Mr. Davis might have borne with patience, although it was intended as a notification to him that his meddling with military affairs must come to an end. But far worse was the necessity put upon him, as a sequel to this act, and in conformity with a resolution of Congress and of the Virginia legislature, of reappointing General Joseph E. Johnston to the command of the army which was to resist Sherman's victorious march to the north. After this he might say that the bitterness of death was past. The Virginia delegation in Congress passed a vote of want of confidence in the government's conduct of the war. Mr. Seddon, considering his honor impugned, and not being unwilling to lay down a thankless task, resigned his post of Secretary of War. Mr. Davis at first wished him to reconsider his action, claiming that such a declaration from congressmen was beyond their functions and subversive of the President's constitutional jurisdiction. But Mr. Seddon insisted, and General John B. Breckinridge was appointed in his place in February for the few weeks that remained before the final crash. Warnings of serious demoralization came daily from the army. Even that firm support to the revolt seemed crumbling. Disaffection was so rife in official circles in Richmond that it was not thought politic to call public attention to it by repression. A detective reported a member of Congress as uttering treasonable language, and for his pains was told at the War Department that matters of that sort were none of his business. It is a curious and instructive thing to note how the act of emancipation had by this time virtually enforced itself in Richmond. The value of slave property was gone. It is true that a slave was still occasionally sold, at a price less than 1/10 of what he would have brought before the war, but servants could be hired of their nominal owners at a barleycorn rate. $6 in gold would pay the hire of a good cook for a year, merely enough to keep up the show of vassalage. In effect, anyone could hire a Negro for his keeping, which was all that anybody in Richmond got for his work. Even Mr. Davis had at last become docile to the stern teachings of events. In his message of November, he had recommended the employment of 40,000 slaves in the army, not as soldiers, it is true, save in the last extremity, with emancipation to come later. The determined buoyancy and fanfaronade of the rebel Department of State had finally given way. On the 27th of December, Mr. Benjamin wrote his last important instruction to John Slidell. It is nothing less than a cry of despair. He recounts the courage and fortitude with which the South has withstood for 4 years the attack of an arrogant and domineering race, vengeful, grasping, and ambitious. The very adjectives show a vast change from the Southern tone of former years. He complains bitterly of the attitude of foreign nations while the South is fighting the battles of England and France against the North. He asks with agonized earnestness what it is they want. Are they determined never to recognize the Southern Confederacy until the United States assent to such action on their part? Do they propose under any circumstances to give other and more direct aid to the Northern people in attempting to enforce our submission to a hateful union? If so, it is but just that we be apprised of their purposes, to the end that we may then deliberately consider the terms, if any, upon which we can secure peace from the foes to whom the question is thus surrendered, and who have the countenance and encouragement of all mankind in the invasion of our country, the destruction of our homes, the extermination of our people. If, on the other hand, he continues, there be any conditions under which England and France would be willing to grant recognition, a frank exposition of such conditions is due to humanity. It is due now, for it may enable us to save many lives most precious to our country by consenting to such terms in advance of another year's campaign. With this alternative, with the frantic offer to submit to any terms which Europe may impose as the price of recognition, and with the scarcely veiled threat of making peace with the North unless Europe should speedily act, the Confederate Department of State closed its 4 years of fruitless activity. Lee assumed command of all the Confederate forces on the 9th of February. His situation was one of unprecedented gloom. The day before he had reported to Richmond that his troops, who had been in line of battle for 2 days at Hatcher's Run, exposed to the bitter winter weather, had been without meat for 3 days. If some change is not made, he said, and the commissary department reorganized, I apprehend dire results. You must not be surprised if calamity befalls us. Mr. Davis endorsed this discouraging dispatch with words of anger and command easy to write. This is too sad to be patiently considered. Criminal neglect or gross incapacity. Let supplies be had by purchase or borrowing. A prodigious effort was made, and the danger of starvation for the moment averted, but no permanent improvement resulted in the situation of affairs. The armies of the Union were closing in from every point of the compass. Grant was every day pushing his formidable left wing nearer the only roads by which Lee could escape. Thomas was threatening the Confederate communications from Tennessee. Sheridan was moving for the last time up the valley of the Shenandoah to abolish Early, while from the south the redoubtable columns of Sherman, the men who had taken Vicksburg, who had scaled the heights of Chattanooga, and, having marched through Georgia, had left Savannah, Loyal, and Charleston evacuated, were marching northward with the steady pace and irresistible progress of a tragic fate. It was the approach of this portent which affected the nerves of the Confederate leaders more than the familiar proximity of Grant. Beauregard, and afterwards Johnston, were ordered to destroy Sherman. Beauregard, after his kind, showed his government its duty in loud and valiant words. He advised Mr. Davis to send him at once heavy reinforcements, to give the enemy battle and crush him, then to concentrate all forces against Grant, march to Washington, and dictate a peace. A plan of limpid simplicity, which was not adopted. Johnston superseded the brilliant Louisianian the next day, and thereafter did what he could, with the scraps and remnants of an army allowed him, to resist the irresistible. A singular and significant attempt at negotiations was made at this time by General Lee. He was now so strong in the confidence of the people of the South, and the government at Richmond was so rapidly becoming discredited, that he could doubtless have obtained the popular support and compelled the assent of the executive to any measures he thought proper for the attainment of peace. From this it was easy for him and for others to come to the wholly erroneous conclusion that General Grant held a similar relation to the government and people of the United States. General Lee seized upon the pretext of a conversation reported to him by General Longstreet as having been held with General E.O.C. Ord under an ordinary flag of truce for exchange of prisoners, to address a letter to Grant, sanctioned by Mr. Davis, saying he had been informed that General Ord had said that General Grant would not decline an interview with a view to a satisfactory adjustment of the present unhappy difficulties by means of a military convention, providing Lee had authority to act. He therefore proposed to meet General Grant, with the hope that upon an interchange of views it may be found practicable to submit the subjects of controversy between the belligerents to a convention of the kind mentioned. In such event, he said, he was authorized to do whatever the result of the proposed interview may render necessary or advisable. Grant at once telephoned these overtures to Washington. Stanton received his dispatch at the Capitol, where the President was, according to his custom, passing the last night of the session for the convenience of signing bills. The Secretary handed the telegram to Mr. Lincoln, who read it in silence. He asked no advice or suggestion from anyone about him, but taking a pen, wrote with his usual slowness and precision a dispatch in Stanton's name, which he showed to Seward and then handed to Stanton to be signed, dated, and sent. The language is that of an experienced ruler, perfectly sure of himself and of his duty. The President directs me to say that he wishes you to have no conference with General Lee unless it be for capitulation of General Lee's army, or on some minor or purely military matter. He instructs me to say that you are not to decide, discuss, or confer upon any political questions. Such questions the President holds in his own hands and will submit them to no military conferences or conventions. Meanwhile, you are to press to the utmost your military advantages. General Grant, on the receipt of this instruction, wrote, in answer to General Lee, that he had no authority to accede to his proposition, such authority being vested in the President of the United States alone. He further explained that General Ord's language must have been misunderstood. Grant reported to Washington what he had done, adding that he would in no case exceed his authority or omit to press all advantages to the utmost of his ability. This closed the last avenue of hope to the Confederate authorities of any compromise by which the dread alternative of utter defeat or unconditional surrender might be avoided. Early in March, General Lee came to Richmond and had a conference with Mr. Davis on the measures to be adopted in the crisis which he saw was imminent. The General-in-Chief had not taken his advancement seriously. He had not sympathized in the slight which it involved towards the civil government. He had positively refused to assume the dictatorial powers with which the Richmond Congress had clearly intended to invest him. He had ostentatiously thanked the President alone for a promotion which in reality came from the President's enemies and critics. He continued to the end, in accordance with the Constitution of the Confederate States, to treat Mr. Davis as the commander-in-chief of the forces. He now laid before him the terrible facts by which the army was environed. Richmond and Petersburg must be evacuated before many days. A new seat for the Confederate government, a new base of defense for the armies must be taken up farther south and west. There is a direct contradiction between Mr. Davis and the friends of General Lee as to the manner in which the former received this communication. Mr. Davis says he suggested an immediate withdrawal, but that General Lee said his horses were too weak for the roads in their present state and that he must wait till the ground became firmer. But General Long, who gives General Lee as his authority, says that the President overruled the general, that Lee wanted then to withdraw his forces and take up a line behind the Staunton River, from which point he might have indefinitely protracted the war. However this may be, they were both agreed that sooner or later the Richmond lines must be abandoned, that the next move should be to Danville, that a junction was to be formed with Johnston, Sherman was to be destroyed, a swarm of recruits would come in after this victory, and Grant, being caught away from his base, was to be defeated and Virginia delivered from the invader. Mr. Davis gravely set forward this program as his own, in his book written 16 years after the war. But before he turned his back forever upon those lines he had so stoutly defended, before he gave up to the nation the capital of the state for whose sake he had deserted his flag, Lee resolved to dash once more at the toils by which he was surrounded. He placed half his army under the command of General John B. Gordon, with orders to break through the Union lines at Fort Stedman and to take possession of the high ground behind them. The reticence in which General Lee enveloped himself in his last years has left his closest friends in doubt as to his real object in this apparently desperate enterprise. General Gordon, who takes to himself the greater share of responsibility for the plan, says, I decided that Fort Stedman could be taken by a night assault, and that it might be possible to throw into the breach thus made in Grant's lines a sufficient force to disorganize and destroy the left wing of his army before he could recover and concentrate his forces. It is certainly true that any fort can be taken, by day or night, if the assaulting party has men enough and is willing to pay the price. But to take a place which cannot be held is not what we expect from a wise and experienced general. Grant had, with singular prescience, looked for some such movement from Lee a month before. He had ordered Parke, then in command of the Ninth Corps, to be ready to meet an assault on his center, and to let his commanders understand they were to lose no time in bringing all their resources to bear on the point of danger. With proper alacrity in this respect, he adds, I would have no objection to seeing the enemy get through. This is one of the most characteristic phrases we have met with in Grant's orders. It throws the strongest light both on his temperament and on the mastery of his business at which he had arrived. A month beforehand, he foresaw Gordon's attack, prepared for it, and welcomed the momentary success which attended it. Under such generalship an army's lines are a trap into which entrance is suicide. The assault was made with great spirit at 4:30 on the morning of the 25th of March. Its initial success was due to a singular cause. The opposing lines at the point chosen were only 150 yards apart. The pickets were only 50 yards from each other. It was therefore a favored point of departure for those Confederates who were tired of the war. Desertions had of late become very numerous, and had naturally been encouraged in every way. Orders had been issued allowing deserters to bring their arms with them. When Gordon's skirmishers came stealing through the darkness, they were at first mistaken for an unusually large batch of deserters, and they overpowered several picket posts without a shot being fired. The storming party at once followed, took the trenches with a rush, and in a few minutes had possession of the main line on the right of Stedman. Turning on the fort, they soon drove out the garrison or made them prisoners. It was the dark hour before dawn, and the defense could not distinguish friends from foes. For a little while General Parke, who acted with his usual vigor and intelligence, was unable to make headway against the invisible enemy who swarmed on both sides of the breach in the lines. General N.B. McLaughlin, who was posted to the left of Fort Stedman, at once got to work and recaptured an outlying battery with the bayonet, and then hurrying into the fort in ignorance of its capture was made prisoner. As soon as it was light, Parke's troops advanced from every direction to mend the breach. R.B. Potter on the left, Wilcox on the right, and John F. Hartranft, who had been held in reserve, attacking directly from the high ground in the rear. The last two, between them, first made short work of the Confederate detachments that were moving on the City Point Road and Telegraph, and searching in vain for 3 forts in the rear of Stedman, which they had been ordered to take. There were no such forts, Humphreys says, where Gordon thought they were. The forts commanding Stedman were part of the main line. By 7:30 Parke had his task well in hand. He had repulsed the Confederate attack to the right and left of Fort Stedman, recaptured 2 of the detached batteries, forced the enemy with heavy losses back into the fort, and concentrated upon them a heavy artillery fire from 3 sides. The artillery under the direction of General J.C. Tidball worked with splendid energy and precision. Hartranft's division carried Fort Stedman by assault, and Gordon withdrew to the Confederate lines what he was able to save of his attacking force. The crossfire of artillery was now so withering that few of the Confederates could get back, and none could come to their assistance. General Parke captured 1,949 prisoners, including 71 officers and 9 stands of colors. His own total loss was about 1,000. But this heavy loss was not the only damage the Confederates suffered. Humphreys and Wright, in command of the troops on the Union left, who were to be routed and dispersed according to General Lee's plan, on being informed of the racket in the center, correctly assuming that Parke could take care of himself, instantly searched the lines in their front to see if they had been essentially weakened to support Gordon's attack. They found they had not, but in the process of gaining this information they captured the enemy's entrenched picket lines in front of them, which, in spite of repeated attempts to regain them, were firmly held, and gave inestimable advantage to the Union army in the struggle of the next week. The net results, therefore, to General Lee of the day's work were a bitter disappointment, a squandering of 4,000 of his best troops against half that number on the other side, and the loss of his entrenched picket line, which brought such dangerous neighbors as Wright and Humphreys within arm's length of him. For several weeks, General Grant's chief anxiety had been lest Lee should abandon his lines. At first he feared a concentration of Lee and Johnston against Sherman, but when the victorious army of the West had arrived at Goldsboro, and formed connection with Schofield, his anxiety on that score was at rest, and there only remained a keen eagerness to make an end of the Army of Northern Virginia. "I was afraid," he says, "every morning that I would awake from my sleep to hear that Lee had gone and that nothing was left but a picket line." Still, just as Lee, though feeling every hour of waiting was fraught with danger, was prevented from moving by the bad roads and the Richmond complications, Grant, although burning to attack, was delayed by the same cause of bad roads and by another. He did not wish to move until Sheridan had completed the work assigned to him in the Valley and joined either Sherman or the army at Petersburg. But at last, satisfied with Sheridan's progress and with Sherman's condition, he resolved to wait no longer, and on the 24th of March, at the very moment when Gordon was making his arrangements for the next day's sortie, Grant issued his order for the great movement to the left which was to finish the war. He intended to begin on the 29th, but Lee's desperate dash of the 25th appeared to the Union commander to indicate an intention to secure a wider opening to the Danville road to facilitate an immediate move of the Confederates westward, and he felt more than ever that not a moment was to be lost. Sheridan reached City Point on the 26th, and Sherman came up from North Carolina for a brief visit the next day. He said he would be ready to move on the 10th of April, and laid before Grant a plan for a cooperative campaign, which was of course satisfactory, as was usually everything that Sherman proposed, but which the swift rush of events soon rendered superfluous. The President was also there, and an interesting conversation took place between these famous brothers-in-arms and Mr. Lincoln, after which Sherman went back to Goldsboro, and Grant began pushing his army to the left with even more than his usual iron energy. It was a great army. It was the result of all the power and wisdom of the government, all the devotion of the people, all the intelligence and teachableness of the soldiers themselves, and all the ability and character which the experience of a mighty war had developed in the officers. Few nations have produced better corps commanders than Sheridan, Warren, Humphreys, Ord, Wright, and Parke, taking their names as they come in the vast sweep of the Union lines from Dinwiddie Courthouse to the James in the last days of March. North of the James was Wetzel, vigilant and capable. Between Grant and the Army of the Potomac was Meade, the incarnation of industry, zeal, and talent, and in command of all was Grant, then in his best days, the most extraordinary military temperament this country has ever seen. When unfriendly criticism has exhausted itself, the fact remains, not to be explained away by any reasoning, subtle or gross, that in this tremendous war he accomplished more with the means given him than any other two on either side. The means given him were enormous, the support of the government was intelligent and untiring, but others have received the same means and the same support, and he alone captured 3 armies. The popular instinct which hails him as our greatest general is correct, and the dilettante critics who write ingenious arguments to prove that one or another of his subordinates or his adversaries was his superior will please for a time their diminishing coteries, and then pass into silence without damaging his robust fame. The numbers of the respective armies in this last grapple may have been the occasion of endless controversy. We take the figures given by General Humphreys, not merely on account of his profound study of the subject and personal acquaintance with it, but because we consider him the most thoroughly candid and impartial man who has written the history of this army. The effective force of infantry of the Army of the Potomac was 69,000, of field artillery 6,000 with 243 guns. The effective force of the infantry of the Army of the James was 32,000, of field artillery 3,000, with 126 guns and 1,700 cavalry, though General Ord took with him only about one-half his infantry. Sheridan's cavalrymen presented for duty 13,000. The grand total of all arms was 124,700. Lee's infantry numbered 46,000, his field artillery 5,000, his cavalry 6,000, in all 57,000. Grant's plan, as announced in his instructions of March 24th, was at first to dispatch Sheridan to reach and destroy the South Side and Danville railroads, at the same time moving a heavy force to the left, primarily to ensure the success of Sheridan's raid, and then to turn Lee's position. But his purpose grew and developed every hour, and before he had been a day away from his winter headquarters he had given up the comparatively narrow scheme with which he started, and had adopted the far bolder and more comprehensive plan which he carried out to his immortal honor. It is probable that to General Sheridan belongs a part of the credit of this change of plan. He often said, in conversation with his friends, that he was delighted after his victory over Early at Waynesboro to find such difficulties in crossing the James as prevented his going south to Sherman, and justified him, neglecting his alternative orders to return to Winchester, in turning east and uniting with the Army of the Potomac. He felt that the war was nearing its end and desired his cavalry to be in it at the death. He thought it best that the Eastern army, which had thus far won scanty laurels when compared with the Western, should have the glory of this final victory. And when he arrived at City Point and found General Grant's plans once more contemplated the possibility of sending his cavalry to Sherman and bringing that commander, after disposing of Johnston, to share in the destruction of Lee, Sheridan urged the General-in-Chief to finish the work immediately with the Army of the Potomac, that had so richly merited the glory which would come of the fruition of their long years of blood and toil. Grant seems to have assured Sheridan that his orders would not require him to go to Sherman except in a remote contingency, and that they had been prepared as a blind in case of failure. Both commanders were full of the spirit of victory. On the evening of the 29th of March, Sheridan's cavalry was at Dinwiddie Courthouse, and the left of the moving force of infantry extended to the Quaker Road, almost to Lee's right flank, on the White Oak Ridge. Grant's purpose had now taken complete shape in his mind. From his tent on Gravelly Creek he wrote to Sheridan, telling him the position of all his corps and adding in simple words which will stir the blood of every reader for ages to come, "I now feel like ending the matter before going back." He ordered Sherman not to cut loose and go after the railroads, but to push for the enemy's right rear. "We will act all together as one army here, until it is seen what can be done with the enemy." The next day Sheridan advanced to Five Forks, where he found a heavy force of the enemy. Lee, justly alarmed by Grant's movements, had drawn all his available troops out of the trenches, dispatched a sufficient force under Fitzhugh Lee to Five Forks to hold that important crossroads, and had taken personal command of the rest of the White Oak Ridge. A heavy storm of rain began the night of the 29th, continuing more than 24 hours and greatly impeding the march of the troops. Warren, on the morning of the 31st, worked his way towards the White Oak Road, but before he reached it, Lee came out of his lines and attacked Warren's advanced division, Aries, with such impetus that it was driven back on the main line at Gravelly Run. There, gallantly supported by General Miles of Humphreys' corps, who made a spirited attack on Lee's left flank, Warren held his own, and in the afternoon moved forward and drove the enemy into his works. Lee, not satisfied with opposing Sheridan at Five Forks with cavalry, had, on the 30th, sent Pickett there with some 7,000 infantry, which, with nearly an equal force of cavalry, was too much for the Union horse to handle. Sheridan was, therefore, on the 31st, forced back to Dinwiddie Courthouse. Here, says Grant, Sheridan displayed great generalship. He fought with obstinate tenacity, disputing every inch of ground, deploying his cavalry on foot, leaving only men enough with his horses to guard them. He gave Pickett and Lee a hard day's work on the way to Dinwiddie, and at night reported his situation to Grant in his usual tone of valorous confidence. Grant, indeed, was far more disturbed than Sheridan. He rained orders and suggestions all night upon Meade, Warren, and Sheridan, the purpose of which was to effect a concentration at daylight on that portion of the enemy in front of Sheridan. Warren, giving his troops who had been marching and fighting for 3 days a few hours' needed rest, came in on Sheridan's right about dawn. But Pickett, seeing that he was out of position, did not wait to be caught between the two Union columns. He withdrew noiselessly during the night and resumed his strongly entrenched post at Five Forks. Grant, in ignorance of this timely flight of Pickett, was greatly incensed at Warren for not having done what is now seen to have been impossible to do, since Pickett was gone before the hour when Grant wished Warren to attack him. The long smoldering dislike of Warren, which had been for months increasing in Grant's mind, now blazed out into active hostility, and he sent an aide-de-camp to Sheridan, suggesting that Warren be relieved from his command. Sheridan hurried up to Five Forks with his cavalry, leaving Warren to bring up the Fifth Corps. Filled, as Sheridan was all this day, with the most intense martial ardor, his judgment and control of his troops were never more powerful and comprehensive. He pressed with his cavalry the retreating Confederates until they came to Five Forks, and then assigned to Merritt the duty of demonstrating strongly on Pickett's right, while with the infantry of the Fifth Corps he was to strike the left flank, which ran along the White Oak Road about 3/4 of a mile east from Five Forks, and then made a return of 100 yards to the north, perpendicular to the road. It was the old tactics of the valley repeated, with the additional advantage in this case that, if successful, he would drive Pickett westward and cut him off from Lee. To guard against any interruption from the east, R.S. Mackenzie had been sent to take possession of the White Oak Road, some 3 miles east of the Forks, a task which he promptly performed, and then came back to take his position on the right of the Fifth Corps. The battle was fought almost as it was planned. The only difference between conception and execution arose from the fact that it had not been practicable to ascertain the precise position of the enemy's left flank, lest the attempt might put them on their guard. Airey's division was on the left, Crawford on the right, Griffin behind Crawford, and in this way they moved to the attack about 4 o'clock. Warren, understanding that the enemy's lines reached farther down the road than was the case, sent Airey's, his smallest division, in a direction which brought it against the angle, and Crawford and Griffin were moving across the road and altogether past the left of the enemy into the woods, when the heavy firing in front of Airey's warned Warren of his error, and he immediately bestirred himself to rectify it, sending his aides in every direction, and finally riding off into the woods to bring Crawford and Griffin to the point where they were so greatly needed. All this occupied considerable time, and in the meanwhile the brunt of the battle fell upon Airey's division. They were hardly strong enough for the work thus accidentally assigned to them, and there might have been a serious check at that moment but for the providential presence of Sheridan himself, who, with a fury and vehemence founded on the soundest judgment, personally led the troops in their attack on the entrenchments. Those who saw him that day will tell the story to their latest breath, how, holding the colors in his hand, with a face darkened with smoke and anger, and with sharp exhortations that rang like pistol shots, he gathered up the faltering battalions of Airey's and swept like a spring gust over Pickett's breastworks. Meanwhile Warren was doing similar work on the right. He had at last succeeded in giving his other 2 divisions the right direction, and came in on the reverse of the enemy's lines. At one moment, finding some hesitation on the part of Crawford's force, Warren, riding forward, says Humphreys, with the corps flag in his hand, led his troops across the field. His horse was shot dead in the final charge. The dusk of evening came down on one of the most complete and momentous victories of the war. Pickett was absolutely routed. Every man was driven from the field except the killed and wounded, and the prisoners, who were gathered in to the number of some 5,000, with a great quantity of guns and colors. As the battle was ending, Sheridan sent an order to Warren relieving him of his command and directing him to report to General Grant for orders. It does not come within the compass of this work to review all the circumstances which led General Grant to entertain so rooted a dislike for Warren, and General Sheridan, who had but a slight acquaintance with him, to adopt his chief's opinions. In removing him from command they were perfectly justified. Honestly holding the opinion they held of him, it was their duty to prevent the evils they thought might result from his retention in so important a trust. But it is not improper here to say that a court of inquiry, which General Warren succeeded in obtaining after General Grant had for 12 years denied it to him, decided that the impressions under which Grant and Sheridan acted were erroneous, and that Warren did his whole duty at Five Forks. Grant never changed his opinion of him. It is true he offered him another command the next day, and soon afterwards he was given an important department to administer, but the General-in-Chief was always implacable towards him. Even in his memoirs, in the midst of the compliments he pays to the memory of Warren, he shows his increasing prejudice in one phrase. In his report of 1865 he said Warren was relieved about the close of this battle. In his memoirs he says the troops were then brought up and the assault successfully made. After Warren was relieved. End of chapter 8.